Hi, everyone. I'm Claire, and I never imagined I'd be writing about my best friend Mia and the mess her life has become. I'm not even sure where to start, but I've been sitting on this for months, and it feels like it's too big to keep bottled up. Maybe sharing it here will help me make sense of it all, or help someone else avoid the mistakes Mia made. Mia and I have been best friends for over 15 years. She's always been this larger-than-life person, charming, confident, the type who can walk into a room and make everyone feel like they've known her forever. She's also a highly respected relationship counselor, the kind who gets invited to speak at conferences and write advice columns for glossy magazines. To everyone on the outside, Mia's life looked perfect. And for a long time, I believed it was. Mia has been married to Brian for almost 20 years. Brian is solid. That's the best way to describe him. He's the quiet, dependable type, the guy who mows the lawn every Saturday morning, remembers your birthday without a reminder, and would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. He's not flashy or exciting, but he's the kind of man you can build a life with. Or at least, that's what I always thought. For years, I envied their relationship. While my own love life was a revolving door of missteps and mismatches, Mia and Brian seemed steady, unshakable. But about a year ago, things started to feel off. Mia's career had skyrocketed. She was booked solid with private clients, hosting workshops, mentoring younger therapists, and even appearing on TV. She was juggling so much, and it was clear she loved the attention and recognition. But with all her focus on her career, it seemed like she was forgetting about Brian. He'd always been supportive, the type to quietly cheer her on from the sidelines. But now, it felt like he wasn't even in the picture anymore. When we'd meet for coffee, I'd ask, "How's Brian doing?" And Mia would wave it off with something like, "Oh, you know Brian, he's fine. He's always been independent." Except he wasn't fine. I could see it, even if Mia couldn't. The last time I saw Brian at a dinner party, he looked tired, worn out, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He barely said a word all night, just sat there nursing a drink while Mia held court, telling stories about her clients and work trips. I remember thinking, how can she not see how unhappy he looks? I tried to bring it up to Mia once, gently. I said something like, "You and Brian should plan a weekend away. You've both been so busy, and it might be nice to reconnect." She laughed and said, "Oh, we're fine, Claire. Don't worry about us. Brian's always been great about letting me do my thing." But I was worried. I could see the cracks forming, even if Mia couldn't. Things took a turn when Mia started talking about Jake. Jake was one of her mentees, a young therapist she was helping through the early stages of his career. At first, it sounded like a typical professional relationship. She'd say things like, "Jake is so eager to learn," or "He reminds me of myself when I was starting out." I didn't think much of it at first. Mia was always mentoring someone, and she genuinely loved helping people. But over time, her mentions of Jake became frequent, too frequent. Suddenly, every conversation we had included something about him. Jake came up with this great idea for a workshop. Jake thinks I should pitch a book deal. Jake said the funniest thing the other day. It was like he'd taken up permanent residence in her head. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Brian must have seen it too, because he started pulling away. He wasn't the type to make a scene or demand answers. That wasn't his style. Instead, he just got quieter. He stopped asking Mia about her day, stopped trying to initiate conversations. He'd sit in the corner at parties, nursing a drink while Mia dazzled the room. It was heartbreaking to watch. I tried to bring it up again, this time more directly. "Mia," I said, "it seems like you and Brian aren't as connected as you used to be. Have you noticed that?" She rolled her eyes and said, "Claire, you're overthinking it. Brian's fine. He's always been the steady one in the relationship. That's just who he is." But he wasn't fine, and neither was their marriage. The more I heard about Jake, the more I started to feel uneasy. He wasn't just a mentee. He was becoming a fixture in Mia's life. She'd invite him to dinners with friends, claiming it was networking. She'd talk about how brilliant he was, how he gets her in a way no one else does. And then there was the way she'd light up when she talked about him, a spark I hadn't seen in years. I should have said something then. I should have told Mia she was crossing a line, even if she didn't see it. But I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't want to interfere. And maybe part of me didn't want to believe that my best friend, the woman who spent her life saving other people's relationships, could be risking her own. But the truth was, Mia was so caught up in her career and her connection with Jake that she couldn't or wouldn't see what was happening. And Brian, poor Brian, was left standing in the wreckage, trying to make sense of it all. The day Brian discovered the affair was the day everything fell apart. Mia had left for one of her many late-night mentoring sessions with Jake. She'd said she'd be back by 10, but when the clock struck midnight and there was no sign of her, Brian began to worry. I wasn't there that night, but Brian told me later that something in his gut told him this wasn't just another late night. He decided to call her, but she didn't pick up. He sent a few texts. Nothing. By 1 a.m., worry had turned into something darker. Suspicion. When Mia finally came home around 2 a.m., Brian was waiting in the living room. She was startled to see him, though she quickly masked it with one of her trademark smiles. "Oh, you're still up," she said casually, slipping off her heels. It was a long session. Jake had some personal stuff he wanted to talk through. Brian didn't respond right away. He just watched her, his eyes scanning her face, her body language. "It's late," he said finally, "and you didn't answer your phone." Mia brushed it off with a wave of her hand. "Oh, I must have left it on silent. You know how focused I get during sessions." Something about her tone, dismissive, almost patronizing, made Brian's stomach churn. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that his wife, the woman he had loved and supported for 2 decades, wouldn't lie to him. But the doubt was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. A few days later, Brian decided to check Mia's laptop. He hated the idea of snooping. He wasn't that kind of man, but the suspicion was eating him alive. Mia was out at another mentoring session, and he figured if there was nothing to hide, he'd find nothing. What he found broke him. Mia's email was still open, and there it was, a string of messages between her and Jake. At first, they seemed professional, discussions about workshops and client referrals, but as Brian scrolled further, the tone changed. There were compliments, personal confessions, and then the unmistakable shift into something romantic. One message from Jake read, "I can't stop thinking about last night. You're incredible, Mia. Being with you feels like everything finally makes sense." And Mia had responded, "You bring out a side of me I thought I'd lost. I don't know where this is going, but I can't deny how I feel." Brian stared at the screen, his hands shaking. It wasn't just an affair. It was an emotional betrayal, too. Jake wasn't just her mentee. He was someone she confided in, someone she turned to when she should have been turning to Brian. But it got worse. In another folder, labeled Personal, Brian found photos, selfies of Mia and Jake at what looked like a secluded cabin, wine glasses in hand, their faces close. There were no explanations needed. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was an ongoing affair. When Brian told me what he'd found, his voice was hollow. I didn't even feel angry at first, he said. It was like the ground fell out from under me. She was supposed to be my partner, Claire, the person I trusted most. And she gave everything we built to him. Brian didn't confront Mia right away. He spent the next few days in a fog, replaying every moment of their marriage in his head, trying to figure out where it had gone wrong. He told me later that he kept asking himself the same question, why wasn't I enough? But I could see it wasn't about him. Mia had built a life around saving other people's relationships, but she hadn't done the work to save her own. She was so focused on being a hero for others that she didn't realize her own marriage was crumbling. Would you like me to move on to part 3? The confrontation, where Brian finally confronts Mia and her response shocks him further, or expand more on his discovery and initial reactions? Let me know. After Brian discovered the affair, he was a shell of the man I used to know. I could see it in his eyes when we met for coffee a week later. He was exhausted, devastated, and barely holding it together. He'd always been a quiet, steady presence, but now there was a heaviness about him, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't put down. I feel like a fool, he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. I gave her everything, Claire. I trusted her. How could I not see it? I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. Brian, this isn't your fault. Mia made her choices. You didn't do anything to deserve this. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with pain. I just don't know what to do now. She says she wants to save the marriage, that it's still worth fighting for. But how can I even look at her after this? I didn't have the answers, but I did know one thing. He didn't have to go through this alone. You don't have to figure it all out right now, I told him. Take it one day at a time. And if you ever need someone to talk to, or even just sit with, I'm here. In the weeks that followed, Brian and I grew closer. At first, it was purely about support. He'd call me after particularly bad fights with Mia, venting about her deflections and excuses. I'd listen, offering whatever comfort I could. Sometimes he'd stop by my place after work, and we'd sit on the couch with a bottle of wine, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't just about Mia either. Brian started opening up about himself in ways I'd never seen before. He talked about his childhood, his dreams, and how much he'd sacrificed to support Mia's career. I guess I just thought, if I kept giving, it would be enough, he said one night. But I don't think it ever was. Hearing him speak so honestly broke my heart. I'd always known Brian as Mia's quiet, dependable husband, but now I saw him as someone who had been overlooked and underappreciated for far too long. I wanted to help him see his own worth, to remind him that he deserved so much more than what Mia had given him. One evening, Brian showed up at my door unannounced. He looked more frazzled than usual, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. I couldn't be in that house tonight, he said. I hope it's okay that I came here. Of course, I said, stepping aside to let him in. You're always welcome. We sat on the couch, and he told me about his latest fight with Mia. She'd accused him of being emotionally unavailable, a claim that was laughable given everything he'd done for her. It's like she's twisting everything to make this my fault, he said, running a hand through his hair. I can't win. You don't have to win, I told him. You just have to decide what's best for you. You don't owe her anything, Brian. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. You're the only person who's really been there for me through all this, he said softly. I don't know what I would have done without you." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled and squeezed his hand. But in that moment, something shifted between us. Over time, our relationship began to change. It wasn't planned or deliberate. It just happened. The more time we spent together, the more we realized how much we had in common, how well we understood each other. Brian started smiling again, laughing even, and it felt like a small victory every time. One night, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, he turned to me and said, "I don't know how to say this without sounding, inappropriate, but being around you, Claire, it feels like I can breathe again." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "You don't have to say anything, Brian. I feel it too." And just like that, the walls between us crumbled. It wasn't about revenge or filling the void Mia had left. It was about finding something real, something honest in the wreckage of what had been. After that night on the porch, everything between Brian and me changed. It wasn't some dramatic shift. It was quiet, gradual, and somehow inevitable. We didn't rush into anything. We both knew the stakes were high. Brian still had to face the reality of his crumbling marriage, and I wasn't about to push him into a decision he wasn't ready to make. But the truth was, Brian had already made his decision. He just hadn't admitted it yet. The next few weeks were a blur of tense conversations and emotional breakthroughs. Brian started pulling away from Mia completely. He moved into the guest room, stopped engaging in her attempts at repairing their marriage, and spent more time at my place than at his own. Mia, of course, noticed the shift. She doubled down on her manipulations, alternating between guilt trips and emotional pleas. "We've been through so much together, Brian," she said during one of their arguments, which he recounted to me later. "You're just going to throw all of that away for some midlife crisis?" But Brian wasn't swayed. "This isn't about a midlife crisis, Mia," he told her. "This is about you betraying me and then trying to make me believe it's my fault. I deserve better." The final straw came during a couples therapy session, something Mia had insisted on. Brian agreed, hoping for closure more than anything else. But instead of taking accountability, Mia used the session as an opportunity to paint herself as the victim. "I've always been the one carrying this relationship," she told the therapist. "Brian's never been emotionally available, and I was just vulnerable. Jake filled a void I didn't even realize existed." Brian told me later that hearing her say those words was like a switch flipping in his mind. "I realized right then that she was never going to take responsibility for what she did," he said. "She'd always find a way to twist things, so she didn't have to face the truth." That night, he packed his things and left for good. Brian moved in with me a few days later. It wasn't something we had planned, but it felt right. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking on eggshells or trying to live up to someone else's expectations. He was just himself. And being with him, seeing him come back to life, made me realize how much I had been holding back too. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges. We had to navigate the fallout from his marriage and the inevitable whispers from people who didn't understand our situation. But we faced it together, one step at a time. Mia didn't take the news well, of course. She sent Brian a barrage of texts accusing him of being unfaithful, an irony that wasn't lost on either of us. "Ironic, isn't it?" Brian said one night, scrolling through her messages. "She cheated on me, but now she's acting like I'm the one who ruined everything." But over time, even Mia seemed to accept the reality of the situation. She and Jake's relationship fizzled out quickly. Apparently, the void Jake filled wasn't enough to sustain anything meaningful. Last I heard, Jake had moved on to another mentorship opportunity, and Mia was trying to rebuild her reputation. Looking back, Brian has no regrets about how things unfolded. Leaving Mia was the hardest thing I've ever done, he told me recently. But it was also the best thing I've ever done. She taught me what I don't want in a partner, and you've shown me what I do. We're still figuring things out. Our relationship is new, and there are moments when the past sneaks up on us. But we're building something real, something honest, and that's more than either of us could have hoped for. If there's one thing Brian would say to anyone in a similar situation, it's this: don't let loyalty to the wrong person keep you in a relationship that's killing your soul. You deserve to be with someone who sees you, values you, and fights for you, not someone who takes you for granted. As for me, I'd add this: sometimes the people who are supposed to help others are the ones who need help the most. And sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from someone who refuses to see the damage they've caused. Do you agree?